The tug of war and emergence of new hardware that pushed game graphics, sound, control and design has been perpetual since the very day mankind turned numbers into images. This power struggle was never clear-cut and evolved at a rate far beyond what we see today. From arcade machines to home computers, from consoles to handhelds and PC, they've all had their fair share of the lead. From the 70s to the early noughties, the sheer wealth of burgeoning technology could create years of historic discussion and reading. But as I am but one man, I can only discuss these within a finite space per video. So for today's episode, let's turn back the digital clock to a time when analog still reigned, and a company that appears often in the history of 3D gaming once again led the way. We start our conversation during the summer of 1989, a massive year for music, film and computing. The PC Engine was dominating Japan, as I covered in another previous episode, kicking off the fight with Sega's most successful console in the Mega Drive on the brink of dominating Western hearts and markets. This was also a year that IBM and Intel made the next step up from the 80386 vanguard of modern PC gaming to the conspicuous release of the 80486. The final 32-bit CPU that Intel shared its branding with other manufacturers. Most painfully for them, the relentless wolf at the door AMD that was created by IBM's own demands. This final release of the 80 series was a long run with improvements over its 5-year cycle. The early models ran at 25 or 33 MHz and later had the FPU coprocessor removed in the SX models. From 1990, Intel improved the chip frequencies across the two models, represented here in my 486 DX266, the very first CPU to offer an internal multiplier from those base clocks. Meaning here with the top of the range in 1992 we got 66 MHz and the lower end of 50 was still a big leap forward, almost twice the performance. The external bus still ran at the same 25 or 33 MHz rate, but the new 8KB internal unified data and instruction cache later doubled to 16 KB on the DX4 models, meaning the CPU can perform two functions during a single external cycle. Coupled with an on-chip FPU math coprocessor and much more efficient pipeline and bus construction, the 486 is roughly twice as fast as the 386 clock for clock. This 66 MHz variant here is circa 4 times faster than the best 386 at the time. More in certain functions, especially floating point ones, ideal for early 3D gaming. Now by this time the CPU had launched. It was exactly the leap up of CPU that John Carmack and co had designed the groundbreaking Wolfenstein 3D to shine on. This was a revelation in many areas, least of which its use of CPU power and raycasting. It was the stepping stone only 12 months later to the paradigm that was Doom, both of which I have covered in huge depth a few years back in 2 videos. What you see here is the very best performance and quality Wolfenstein 3D and Doom could run at from launch in 1993. The DX4 was a year out and that could run at 100 MHz. Recall that the 386 was still the dominant CPU across the PC space and the high-end 486 DX2 here was not mainstream at all. The 386 would run more like this. A generational leap if you ever saw one, and I remember this well as I first saw Doom running in a computer store near me in 1993 that I used to work in. I was gobsmacked and purchased the shareware version for the store demo, obviously, but also took home to play on my 386, and this is what greeted me. I was stunned at the difference, but reducing the quality and screen size brought it closer to the shop experience. I did manage to upgrade to a 100 MHz Pentium a couple of years later, which can run this game with ease at a level we now see on handhelds and on screen. Now, the 486 was an incredible CPU that pushed the boundaries of the PC market, running complex games like Doom or Wolf at excellent levels, but it was more competent in 2D titles such as the classic Lucasfilm greats in Indiana Jones, Monkey Island, and even Rayman. Although capable of running far more demanding titles such as Core Design's seminal Tomb Raider, Lara struggled to get up to speed on the DX machine. Earlier benchmarks such as Descent fared better, but still lower than acceptable frame rates, as it was starting to show its age by 1996. Now, Quake sums this up perfectly as another id game that created a full 3D world constructed of polygons, particles and real-time lighting. A groundbreaking game and engine that endured for years to come, and a multitude of titles used it. An engine designed for CPU rather than graphics card accelerated rendering, it struggled on the 486 and was not really designed for it. More the Pentium, which came out in '94, which delivered the expectation and quality that was originally intended by the developers. In between this time, the console market was not standing still, and that meant that the Jaguar had already started to demonstrate 1 year prior in '93 that the 486 was no match for the might of Tom and Jerry. This test case in Wolf 3D was from John Carmack himself and was done quickly, in 1 month, and was superior to the DOS PC version, running at a much higher resolution, giving sharper textures and better sound. Both music and sound effects are also improved, with Bobby Prince's MIDI soundtrack and higher frequency samples standing out when you play the game. The screen size is larger with more weapons, and again they're improved in quality, and it was an early example of a remaster more than a port from the PC version 2 years earlier. But this was really the groundwork for Carmack to dig into the much bigger, better and more relevant Doom port that he supported and helped with, that was actually artificially held back so that Wolf 3D could secure a few more sales of the market until that Jaguar port landed. And that meant that all purchases would be dropped through the floor when Doom finally landed a few months after the PC version. The biggest benefit from the Jaguar port over the PC version was its colour depth. 16-bit depth due to the Jaguar's CRY colour scheme offered a much smoother gradient from light to dark than the PC's 8-bit RGB system, which created banding. But the resolution reduction helped keep the performance close to the 486 DX2 here, which is a testament to the Jaguar's largely untapped potential. Recall, a 486 PC was into the thousands of pounds or even more dollars, and the top-end DX2 here would have been close to 8 or 10 times the cost of the lowly Jaguar in 1993. Make no mistake, in 93, when the little Atari Cat launched, it was a very powerful machine for the future yet to come, and far more economical. But it was not the true shift to the multimedia vertex-based graphics that was to come, and the 3DO is almost the perfect hybrid of the archetypal 2D and then 3D focused gaming machines. It kicked off the home revolution after Sega and Namco and more had been pushing this hard in the arcades. 2D was becoming more and more irrelevant. The 3DO was something special, for it truly looked, felt and was ahead of anything on the market at the time, and that included PC. But even though it was expensive, it was still cheaper than what it was competing against, and that was the top-end PC market. But sadly, it was the birth of 3D here, and that meant the death of the 486. Now step forward the next best and new answer, the very first Pentium processor. By mid-1994, the latest Pentium was raising the game again with a full 100 MHz variant that was making waves in the PC space just as this very 32-bit console war was heating up. Now, although the Pentium launched tail end of 93, this 100 MHz top tier didn't launch until 1994, the mid or end of 94 in fact. And this was going toe to toe with the three new CD based consoles, and all three of them were making a big impact, and PC lost the technical edge here. The CPU and RAM was greater, but the extra co-processors, exotic technology packed into these gaming boxes enabled them to deliver a far greater level of graphics and performance than anything else. For the next year and a half, they fought almost amongst themselves, as PC had not yet moved into graphic acceleration for 3D. The history and legacy and the timescales you can see on screen, and it was a few years where PC was really falling behind the console market. Both the PS1 and the Saturn were really pushing above what you would normally expect on the PC at all, and they really couldn't get close to anywhere near what they were delivering, or far away from what the arcade was really pushing forward on. But then 3D acceleration started to land, and a very huge company at the time in S3 had the chance to really kick this off in the PC space, and they did with the huge S3 Virge range, which was the very first 2D and 3D accelerators in the market in late 1995. Now this was becoming relevant because consoles were pushing ahead of what PC could deliver. Just as we'd seen before with the 486DX being 4 times faster than the 386, the Pentium 100 was almost 4 times faster than the 486DX2 here. If we compare Tomb Raider, it runs around 4 to 5 FPS, and then running on a Pentium 100 in fully software driven mode, then it runs around 22 to 23 FPS, a decent increase, and you can also increase the resolution and quality of the game, but running it at 640 by 480 at high settings is still off the cards. It's not quite good enough. If you compare this to Quake on the software test in the game itself, the FPS test, as you can see on screen comparing the two, you can again see it's around 4 times the speed comparing these two systems at the same resolutions. And this means moving from 93 to 94, you take games like Quake that were released in 96 or Tomb Raider in 96, and even things like Screamer in 95, they're fully playable and smooth, albeit not quite as perfect as they were in later hardware on the Pentium, and fully unplayable and unusable on the 486 66 MHz here. That is a substantial increase. The PC world needed 3D hardware acceleration, and it needed it fast because the consoles were making it look very outdated indeed. But in 1996, we were on the verge of somebody stepping up and taking that fight forward, but they weren't quite ready for what they needed to deliver. As the shift away from DOS-based operating systems, GUI-based operating systems like 95 and 98, this shift away from disk-based operating systems and direct BIOS access was much more pleasant and easier on the user, but it had an impact on the hardware requirements of games and what you could get out of the system. My 16 megabyte I486 DX2 here could run Windows 3.1, but it doesn't run anywhere near as well as a DOS-based operating system I've left it with here in FreeDOS. And that means you still spent a lot of your time getting games to run by diving into autoexec and config.sys. Back in the day, you used to create your own menu and just basically choose from that as you booted the operating system to get into the version you needed. A classic example was X-Wing, which I think everyone struggled with getting that game to work because it was so demanding at that tail end of DOS-based hardware.
This is Red Leader. Stay close and watch for enemy fighters. Got it. Follow me. I'm on it. Nice shot, Red 2.
But much meatier hardware was required to run Windows and all the games that came alongside it. Now, Tomb Raider was one of the earliest ones to really push forward in using accelerated versions for all of the graphics cards that were available on the market at the time. And packed onto the unfinished business release that came out a year later, just before Tomb Raider 2 launched, that I still have here, actually has all the drivers on the disc, as you can see. Now, these DOS XEs were different versions you dropped into the folder to run against or a driver, and the Windows version supported DirectX a year later with Tomb Raider 2 in '97. Now, sadly, I can't get the drivers here to work, or the version, the XE, to work on the S3325 on Windows 98. I will be playing around with it a little more, so I'm sure I'll get it working in the end. But this is a sign of just what it used to be like back then, where even if you had the right hardware and the right configuration, driver compatibility, and the general huge amount of effort you had to go through to get things to work. I've lost count of all the times I used to have things like an ATI Rage card, an NVIDIA card, and you couldn't get an OpenGL driver, you couldn't get the Glide driver to work on the particular game, and here in the S3 Virge you can't even get some DirectX versions to work, or at least there's issues, corruption and general fun to be had to make it work. Now, although I can't manage to get Tomb Raider working here, there will be far more playing around and messing around with the particular hardware to get it to work again. I'm sure there's something out there that I can either find in some obscure forum or which particular driver needs to get this version to work. Happily, I can report that Tomb Raider 2 demo that comes on the disc does fully work and allows me to test the game. There are more tests to come, including the full Tomb Raider game that I've got and other games to come, but here I just want to dive into the original S3 Virge, the very pioneer of 3D graphic rendering. Above anything else, the first thing to hit the market in around mid-1996, and Tomb Raider 2 here, late 96, early 97, was the first direct 3D accelerated version that supported the S3 Virge. So we can compare this software-driven version and the hardware-driven version at 320 by 240 resolutions. Although they were the pioneers in 3D rendering on PC, it wasn't all sweetness and roses when it comes to the S3 Virge's performance in 3D rendering. And arguably, it's a bit of a mixed bag, even if it does enhance the quality overall. They had the market to themselves for a while, but the performance was shocking. So bad that at times staying pure software driven was a better experience, as proven here with the very early Virge 325. It can actually perform better than the later GX and DX models in certain titles in certain areas due to some odd choices they made in terms of their hardware configuration, their memory bandwidth, memory allocations. But overall, in terms of the graphics accelerated version here, you can see all the standard trinkets you would expect, so texture filtering, perspective correct texture mapping, Full hardware base Z depth, so you don't get vertex calculations, clipping and Z fighting in the game at all, so all of that level has gone. And then you get things like the underwater shading effect, the light cascade and the vertex shading across the polygons, which is slightly better and enhanced, but generally the overall visual quality, the effects in the title and the texture quality isn't that significantly improved over the base software driven version. But performance can be better. It's certainly more consistent. It wouldn't say it's a huge leap forward, but bearing in mind that it is improving the visual quality, if not the resolution, and it can be fighting back and forth between who wins, software or hardware. It's very close. It's definitely better than the software driven version, that is without a shadow of a doubt, but it's certainly not much better. I've already covered the PlayStation 1 with its GTE engine that enhanced the vertex calculation, making it very quick and much better at drawing those than it would be here on the PC. And even the Sega Saturn was a much better 3D machine than this combination of a Pentium 100 and an S3 Virge. Running something like Quake 2 here on the Pentium 100, remember I cannot get an OpenGL driver to work on this on the S3 Virge because it didn't really have OpenGL support. There was a mini driver made, but the one I've tried just doesn't fire up at all on this or Quake GL version, so I can't test that at the moment. But the performance is quite low. But I will be covering the whole range of cards, including far more on this original graphics card accelerator and moving through the entire generation of the PC markets right up to the early 2000s, and you can see just how quickly we went from behind the consoles to in front of them in a very short space of time. Going from something like the Pentium 100 here on Quake 2, which runs around 8 or 9 FPS, it's a significant leap forward using a TNT2, much better quality, much improved texture mapping, filtering and Z depth over what we saw on the S3 Virge, and performance here in the OpenGL driver is much better. Not 60 FPS at this resolution, 640 by 480, but certainly a lot more consistent and smoother. But there is far more to come in this PC landscape as we move through the generations, but I hope you enjoyed this early and quick look back at the original origins of 3D gaming as we move from 2D to 3D, and just how the PC market was completely transformed in a very short space of time. But it was playing catch up against those consoles that really pushed 3D technology forward. And I will be covering those, this and much more in future videos to come. So if you're keen to see just how an ATI 3D Rage performs against an S3 or a GeForce 2 MX or an Voodoo 2 or a Hercules card or a Cairo 2 or anything that's come through from generations to generation, and just how close that Dreamcast was to the very best that was available on the PC at the time, then you know what you need to do. You need to click that subscribe button, support me and get my views and viewers up, because that will really help me continue the kind of work that you guys enjoy, and hopefully this is just the start of things to come. Stay cool, stay calm, stay retro.